Friends, this morning we are continuing our sermon series called Giving It Up. In the first sermon in this series, we looked at giving up control. And we talked about the ways that when we think we need to be in control, or when we try to be in control of our own lives as well as the lives of others, that it can often cause harm, not just to us, but to those around us. Then we looked at giving up expectations and how those unrealistic expectations that we have of ourselves and of others can also cause harm and hurt and despair. Do you sense a pattern here? Today we're looking at giving up superiority. And in addition to the story of the woman at the well, which Wally so wonderfully read for us. Thank you, Wally. I am reading from the letter from our brother James, chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. And the translation I'm using today is called the Inclusive Bible. So the words might be a little different than what you're used to, depending upon the translation that you prefer to read. My sisters and brothers, your faith in our glorious Savior Jesus Christ must not allow favoritism. Suppose there should come into your assembly a person wearing gold rings and fine clothes, and at the same time a poor person dressed in shabby clothes. Suppose further you were to take notice of the well-dressed one and say, "Sit right here in the seat of honor," and say to the poor one, "You can stand," or "Sit over there by my footrest." Haven't you in such a case discriminated in your hearts? Haven't you set yourselves up like judges who hand down corrupt decisions? Listen, dear sisters and brothers, didn't God choose those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom promised to those who love God? Yet you've treated poor people shamefully. Aren't rich people exploiting you? Aren't they the ones who haul you into the courts and who blaspheme that noble name by which you've been called? You're acting rightly, however, if you fulfill the venerable law of the Scriptures. Love your neighbor as yourself. But if you show favoritism, you commit sin, and that same law convicts you as transgressors. May God add wisdom to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. The little girl was thirsty, and the water she so desperately craved was right there in front of her. So she walked over to the water fountain, stood up on her tippy toes, and started to take a drink. Now, on any other day, this would be normal behavior, but this wasn't just any other day. Because no sooner had she taken a drink of that cool, clear water that young Olive Thurman felt a hand grab her shoulder. It was her father, Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman, the African-American scholar and theologian who was also dean of the chapel at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He was on vacation in the South with his family, far from their D.C. home. And the reason he had grabbed his daughter while she innocently drank was the sign above the fountain that said, "Whites only." And because of that sign, Dr. Thurman felt the agony of having to explain to his young daughter that in the South, in the 1930s, little black girls couldn't just drink from any water fountain. They couldn't use any bathroom or swim in any pool or play at any rest stop playground designated for white children only. In that moment, he had to try to explain to a thirsty little girl, as tears formed in both of their eyes, that she had to pay attention to the signs around them that separated the somebodies from the nobodies, the superiors from the inferiors, from those allowed to drink and those who were not. Now, even though this incident happened decades ago, we still feel the sting of the signs and systems that separate and divide us into categories: male, female, black, white, Christian, non-Christian, fat, thin, legal, illegal, gay, straight, rich, poor, pretty, ugly. I could go on for days. But these binary categories perpetuate the notion that one group is superior while the other is not. I imagine many of us have been sorted into categories like this, separated into the haves and the have-nots. Maybe you were the one who felt limited and made to feel inferior. Or maybe you were the one who was doing the limiting, intentionally or not, keeping others away from the fountain. Maybe you saw the sign plain as day, or maybe you felt the sign in more subtle ways. Either way, you knew which group you belonged to. You knew your place in the world. Does this make you uncomfortable? It should. Because this notion of experiencing or expressing superiority is an uncomfortable topic. It's a hard message to hear. And friends, let me tell you, it's even harder from up here to preach it. But Jesus never said that following him would be easy, did he? In fact, what he did and what he taught made those around him feel uncomfortable all the time. Kind of like what we heard this morning from the Gospel of John. Now, at the beginning of chapter 4, Jesus is on the road, leaving Judea in the south and heading to Galilee in the north. And John writes that Jesus had to go through Samaria, which to our ears sounds pretty insignificant. It'd be like saying that from here we need to go through, have to go through Phoenix in order to get to the west side of town. But to second century Jews who were reading this message, this probably raised a few eyebrows, because everyone knew that if you were a Jew in the first and the second centuries, you avoided Samaria at all costs. Rather than take the shorter route, they went either east to the Jordan River or west to the coast of the Mediterranean in order to avoid Samaria and the dreaded Samaritans who lived there. After all, Samaritans were inferior to the Jews. They were racially mixed, the products of interreligious marriage between the Jews that had been left behind during the Babylonian exile and the new settlers from Syria and Mesopotamia many, many generations before. Their beliefs and practices were contrary to the Jewish faith, and as such, the Samaritans were despised by the Jews, who felt that they were superior to the Samaritans. And to be fair, the Samaritans felt the same way about the Jews, too. So in order to avoid them, the Jews avoided the region altogether. But Jesus must have missed the sign that said at the border, "Jews, keep out." Either that or he just ignored it altogether. Because instead of turning to the right or to the left and taking the long way around, instead Jesus goes straight. He does not pass go. He does not collect $200. He goes right into Samaria and into enemy territory. And it's there that he meets the woman at the well. The woman at the well. We say that so easily, don't we? As if it is her name. But like so many women in the Bible, she is nameless because she's a woman. And women were inferior to men. But being a woman wasn't her only sin. In fact, she was also a harlot, an adulteress, a sinner, disgusting, disreputable, despicable. It said so on the invisible sign that she wore around her neck. And as if it wasn't bad enough that she was made to feel inferior by the women in her community who treated her so badly that she couldn't bring herself to go with them to the well in the cool of the morning to draw water. Instead, she had to go at noon. We, for centuries, we holier-than-thou Christians have dissed her and her behavior as lewd, wanton, and disgraceful. The superiority dripping like warm syrup off the top of a short stack of pancakes. I love that image. But Jesus ignored the sign around her neck, choosing not to ignore her, engaging her in a conversation that literally changes her life. Through his actions, Jesus shows us how to give up superiority in the way that we behave toward others. As a woman, a Samaritan, and a sinner, this woman had 3 strikes against her right there. Jesus had every reason to treat her as inferior, but he didn't. Instead, he offers her grace. He offers her new life. He offers her living water to quench the dry and painful cracks in her life. Living water that had the power to help her never feel inferior ever again. And through this encounter, we are hopefully inspired to change the way that we treat other people as well, people we have considered inferior to us. There's a story you may have seen on the internet about a pastor named Jeremiah Stepek. On the morning that he was to be introduced as a megachurch's new pastor, he showed up dressed like this, like a homeless man. As he walked around the church for about 30 minutes before worship, only a handful of the nearly 10,000 people who were there said anything to him at all. And even though he asked some people for change in order to get some food, no one gave him a thing. As the service began, he took a seat in the front row, but the ushers came and told him, "No, you need to sit in the back." Reluctantly, he did. And as he sat there, he tried greeting those that were in the seats around him, but no one said a word, their dirty looks speaking volumes. Soon it was time to introduce the new pastor, and as his name was called, the congregation began to clap, very excited. And when the homeless man in the back row stood up and walked down the center aisle of that big mega church, one by one the people stopped clapping when they realized what had happened. When he got to the stage, Jeremiah took the mic from the elder who had introduced him. He recited the parable of the sheep and the goats from the end of Matthew's gospel. And then he told his new creation how he had been treated by them before the service. And as his parishioners hung their heads in shame, he said to them, "Today I see a gathering of people, not a church of Jesus Christ. The world has enough people, but not enough disciples. When will you become a disciple?" And with that, he dropped the mic and walked off the stage. How often have we judged other people without knowing everything there is to know about them, or even something about them? We do it when we're standing in the grocery store line and the person ahead of us is paying with food stamps. We do it when we see someone begging for money on the corner, or when we see a person of color wearing a hoodie instead of what we would consider a respectable jacket, or when someone cuts us off or changes lanes without signaling, or displays a colorful hand gesture when we aren't driving according to their expectations. How often do we allow superiority to rule by letting racism, classism, and other types of isms to slip into our vocabulary, whether intentionally or not? How often do we think, well, I'm a better mother, or I'm a better worker, I'm a smarter student, I'm a better Christian? When we do these things, we devalue the other person, and we see them as less than who they are, a person of sacred worth, a precious child of God, created in God's image and beloved by God. When we let our feelings of superiority devalue another, God weeps. Jesus weeps. And for that reason alone, we need to give it up. We need to give up superiority. But the question of the day is always, how? How do we give up feeling superior and instead interact with others from a position of humility, compassion, and grace? Well, I think that first we need to understand where that is coming from. Why is it that we feel it's necessary for us to feel superior in the first place? And as I was researching this sermon, I came across a sermon of the same title. Obviously, this guy had done the same series that I'm doing. His name is Father Thomas Pettigrew. He's an Episcopal priest at the Church of the Holy Cross in New York. And here is what he suggested in his sermon. He suggested that our need or desire to be superior is part of our human condition. He says, Darwinian theory states that out in the world, only the fittest survive. And the fittest are, of course, the most superior. They're the ones who have the resources needed to survive, the food, the shelter, the money. He goes on to say, we want at a very primal level to be the fittest, to have the most, and be more likely to survive. And that, he says, makes us behave like we are superior. He also says that because of our pride and the desire to be right, to be on top, to have the last word, and to always be in control, that we are driven to be number one, even at the expense of others. Our egos want to be, indeed they need to be superior, no matter what the cost. Now, one might say that based on Father Pettigrew's theory that there's really nothing we can do, that feelings of superiority are just a part of who we are, that survival of the fittest is real and necessary, and that what the ego wants, the ego will get. But I disagree. I think there are things we can do to control those behaviors that cause harm and wound other people. And there's a blogger out there by the name of Terry Cohen who agrees. She writes in response to a question posted on the online Q&A website called Quora, and I quote, recognizing there will always be someone better looking, smarter, faster, and more talented than you are is a nice start toward being genuinely humble. Yeah? But if we want to truly eliminate the feelings of superiority, and I use the words we and our intentionally because I experience all of this just as much as any of you. Here is what Terry Cohen suggests we do. Number one, find the good in people and compliment them. Make their day instead of your own. Number two, when you're about to brag on yourself, very silently in your head say, stop. This creates the self-awareness we need in order to control our behavior and stop bad behavior in its tracks. Number three, take something you do well and teach it to others. And then when they do it well, praise them, not yourself. 4, when someone pays you a compliment, say thank you and smile and then shut your mouth. Don't say another word. Don't agree or say how you got to be so good at whatever it is that they're complimenting you about. Number 5, never make someone else feel bad in order to make yourself feel good. She writes, that is just being a jerk. I agree. Number 6, think about and write about what you think of yourself and how you behave toward other people. Again, this is that self-awareness piece. And it's an important path to having healthy confidence without the arrogance that can sometimes go along with it. Number 7, find a role model you can emulate, one who is successful and handles his or her success with humility and grace. And finally, number 8, give credit to other people, recognizing them for their contributions to a project. She concludes by saying this, focusing on other people in a positive way builds a joy in you that can't be matched by self-praise. It builds humanity as well as humility. I love that. God's call upon our lives, my friends, is to humble ourselves, replacing pride and superiority, which destroys, with a desire to see others exalted. As C.S. Lewis once wrote, and this quote is on your bulletin, if you like, take your bulletin with you and pop this on your refrigerator as a reminder. Humility isn't thinking of yourself less, but thinking less of yourself. It's not thinking that you are low and worthless, but rather lowering yourself so others are lifted up. Humility is what Jesus did. It was the way that he lived his life. And it's what he wants us to do, to demonstrate humility, not superiority. Elevating those who, like the woman at the well, would otherwise feel unworthy, unloved, invisible, or inferior. In our reading this morning from James, we are reminded that when we treat people differently because of the way they dress or because of their standing in the world, that we demonstrate a spirit of discrimination in our hearts. He writes, haven't you set yourselves up like judges who hand down corrupt decisions? Instead, he says, we must love our neighbors as ourselves and treat others with the dignity and the respect that they deserve. We are meant to be clothed in humility, not superiority, to meet people where they are and not shun them because they don't measure up to our flawed human standards. We are called to remember that we are all children of God, people of sacred worth, period. We are meant to get rid of the signs that separate, the systems that discriminate, and the attitudes that tear us apart. Remember the story about Jeremiah Stepek that I just shared with you? The preacher who dressed up like a homeless man? It's a pretty powerful story, isn't it? Yeah, too bad it isn't true. Fake news. That's right, it was completely made up. Even the picture's not real. But there was, and there has been, other pastors who have done the very same thing. They've dressed up as homeless and then taken a look at what their congregations did. Last fall, a pastor by the name of James McDonald, he was a founding pastor of Harvest Bible Chapel, a mega church in Chicago. He disguised himself as a homeless man and sat in front of his church and then secretly videotaped what happened. And his results, the results of his experiment, were quite different from the fake Jeremiah. The people in his church brought him food. They also brought him money. They prayed with him. They asked him if he needed anything. They even invited him to come into worship and invited him to sit with them. What he witnessed from his church was unconditional love, compassion, and grace. He witnessed humility because the people in his church gave up superiority long ago. Not just for Lent, but for good. May we also do the same. Amen.